Imagine walking into your school's art room after hours, thinking you're alone, when suddenly you're surrounded by the worst bullies in school, holding cans of bright red spray paint aimed directly at your face. That's exactly what happened to Lily Martinez, a quiet 16-year-old who kept to herself and spent most afternoons painting in the empty art studio. What these cruel students didn't realize was that behind her gentle exterior and paint-stained fingers lay years of deadly training that would turn their twisted prank into the biggest mistake of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Riverside High School as Lily Martinez carefully cleaned her paintbrushes in the art room sink. The hallways had emptied an hour ago, leaving only the distant sounds of the janitorial staff and the basketball team's practice echoing from the gymnasium. She preferred these quiet moments when she could work on her paintings without the constant chatter and judgment that followed her through the school day. Her latest canvas depicted a stormy seascape, dark waves crashing against jagged rocks, reflecting the turbulence she felt every time she walked through these halls. At 16, Lily had learned to make herself invisible. Standing barely 5'3" with shoulder-length brown hair that she often wore pulled back in a simple ponytail, she dressed in oversized sweaters and jeans that helped her blend into the background. Her family had moved to Millbrook, North Carolina just 3 months ago when her mother, a registered nurse, accepted a position at the regional medical center. The transition from their comfortable life in Portland, Oregon to this small suburban town had been jarring for everyone, but especially for Lily, who had always struggled with making new friends. Her mother worked long shifts at the hospital, often pulling doubles to establish herself in the new position, which meant Lily spent most evenings alone in their modest 2-bedroom apartment. Her older brother Marcus lived 20 minutes away, in the next town over, working as a security consultant after completing 2 tours with the Marines. He tried to visit when he could, but his work kept him busy, leaving Lily to navigate the social minefield of Riverside High largely on her own. The school itself wasn't particularly large, housing about 800 students from Millbrook and the surrounding rural areas. Basketball dominated the social hierarchy, with the team's success bringing the entire community together on Friday nights. The players walked the halls like royalty, their leather jackets serving as crowns that granted them access to any table in the cafeteria and immunity from most disciplinary actions. At the top of this pyramid sat Connor Hayes, a 6'4" senior whose three-point shooting had already earned him scholarship offers from several universities. Lily had encountered Connor and his crowd during her second week at Riverside. She'd been sitting alone in the library during lunch, sketching in her notebook, when a basketball came rolling across the floor and bumped into her feet. Connor had sauntered over with his trademark smirk, his blonde hair perfectly styled despite having just come from practice. When she'd quietly picked up the ball and handed it to him, he'd made some comment about her paint-stained fingers being gross, loud enough for his friends to hear and laugh. The incident had been minor, but it established her place in the social order, marking her as someone the popular crowd could safely ignore or mock without consequence. Jessica Walsh, Connor's girlfriend and the undisputed queen of the junior class, had taken particular notice of Lily after that library encounter. Jessica possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having to question her place in the world. With perfectly straight blonde hair, flawless makeup, and a wardrobe that somehow made even the school's standard uniform look fashionable, she commanded attention wherever she went. Her father owned the largest car dealership in town, and her mother sat on the school board, giving Jessica a level of influence that even some teachers seemed to respect. The first real confrontation had come during art class, the one period where Lily actually felt comfortable. Mrs. Rodriguez, the art teacher, had paired students for a collaborative project, and by some cruel twist of fate, Lily found herself working with Jessica. While Lily approached the assignment with genuine enthusiasm, excited to share her passion for painting, Jessica treated it as an inconvenience that was beneath her social status. She'd spent most of the class period texting on her phone, leaving Lily to do the majority of the work while making occasional snide comments about how seriously Lily was taking what Jessica called a throwaway elective. The project had received an A, which Mrs. Rodriguez had announced to the class while specifically praising the sophisticated color choices and composition. Jessica had smiled and accepted the compliment as if she'd contributed equally, but Lily could see the flash of irritation in her eyes. That afternoon, Lily had discovered her locker had been vandalized with permanent marker. Crude words scrawled across the metal surface that the custodian had to spend an hour scrubbing clean. Since then, the harassment had escalated gradually. Jessica's friends would accidentally bump into Lily in the hallways, causing her to drop her books or spill her lunch. They'd whisper loud enough for her to hear as she passed, making comments about her clothes, her quiet nature, or her obvious lack of social connections. The basketball players had joined in, with Connor occasionally flicking paper balls at the back of her head during the classes they shared. Lily had tried to tell herself that it would pass, that eventually they'd get bored and move on to someone else. She'd dealt with difficult situations before, though nothing quite like this systematic campaign of humiliation. What kept her going was the knowledge that this wasn't permanent, that high school would end, and that she could endure anything for a few more months until graduation. She had dreams of attending art school, of finding a place where her creativity would be valued rather than mocked. But as she stood in the empty art room that Friday afternoon, carefully washing the last traces of paint from her brushes, Lily had no idea that her quiet endurance was about to be tested in ways she never could have imagined. The Martinez family had always been close-knit, but the move to North Carolina had stretched those bonds thin. Lily's mother, Carmen, had worked double shifts for months to save enough money for the relocation expenses, often coming home exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. The opportunity at Millbrook Regional Medical Center represented a significant step up in her career, but it also meant starting over in a place where she knew nobody and had to prove herself all over again. Their new apartment was a far cry from the cozy house they'd rented in Portland. The complex sat on the edge of town, where the suburban developments gave way to farmland and strip malls. The walls were thin enough that they could hear their neighbors' television shows, and the heating system made strange clicking noises that kept Lily awake during her first few weeks. Her mother had tried to make it feel like home by hanging Lily's artwork on the walls and arranging their familiar furniture in the small living space, but everything felt temporary and unsettled. What Lily missed most was the sense of belonging she'd had in Portland. Her old school hadn't been perfect, but she'd found her niche in the art program and had developed genuine friendships with other creative students. They'd spend weekends visiting galleries, experimenting with different mediums, and dreaming about their futures as professional artists. Her portfolio had been strong enough to earn encouragement from her teachers about applying to prestigious art schools, and she'd been building toward that goal with focused determination. The transition had been hardest on her relationship with Marcus, who had been more than just a brother to her. After their father had walked out when Lily was 12, Marcus had stepped into a protective role that went far beyond typical sibling relationships. Despite being only 4 years older, he'd taken on responsibilities that most teenagers would have resented, helping with homework, attending parent-teacher conferences when their mother was working, and generally making sure Lily felt safe and supported. Marcus had joined the Marines straight out of high school, partly for the financial benefits that would help support the family, but also because he'd felt a genuine calling to serve. His deployment overseas had been difficult for everyone, but especially for Lily, who'd gone from having a constant protector to relying entirely on their overworked mother. When he'd returned and settled in North Carolina ahead of their move, It had seemed like a sign that everything would work out. During his military service, Marcus had developed an expertise in close-quarters combat and defensive tactics that went far beyond standard training. He'd always been athletic, but the Marines had transformed him into someone who moved with precise control and carried himself with quiet confidence. More importantly, he'd learned to read situations and people with an accuracy that often surprised civilians. He could spot potential trouble before it escalated and had developed an almost protective instinct that extended to anyone he cared about. When the family had been planning their move to North Carolina, Marcus had insisted on teaching Lily basic self-defense techniques. He'd framed it as general safety knowledge that any young woman should have, but Lily suspected he was more concerned about her starting over in an unfamiliar place than he let on. They'd spent several weekends in a rented gym space, where Marcus had introduced her to fundamental concepts of situational awareness, basic strikes, and escape techniques. What had started as reluctant participation on Lily's part had gradually become something more serious. She discovered that she had natural coordination and an ability to focus that translated well to martial arts training. Marcus had been impressed with her progress and had begun incorporating more advanced techniques from Krav Maga, the Israeli combat system that emphasized practical self-defense in real-world situations. Unlike traditional martial arts that focused on forms and ceremony, Krav Maga was designed for survival, teaching students to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. The training sessions had become a highlight of Lily's weeks in Portland, giving her confidence that extended beyond physical capabilities. Marcus had emphasized that the most important aspects of self-defense were awareness and avoidance, but he'd also made sure she understood that she was capable of protecting herself if circumstances required it. By the time they moved to North Carolina, Lily had developed skills that would have surprised anyone who knew her as the quiet girl who preferred paintbrushes to sports. However, she'd made a conscious decision to keep this aspect of her life private at Riverside High. Her experience in Portland had taught her that being different often meant being targeted, and she'd hoped that by maintaining a low profile, she could avoid the kind of social conflicts that seemed to follow students who stood out. The art room had become her sanctuary, a place where she could focus on her creative work and forget about the daily stress of navigating hostile social dynamics. Mrs. Rodriguez had become an unexpected ally in this effort. The art teacher was originally from Mexico and had moved to North Carolina with her husband, so she understood something about starting over in an unfamiliar place. She'd noticed Lily's talent immediately and had made subtle efforts to encourage her without drawing unwanted attention from other students. Their conversations about technique and artistic vision had become some of the few positive interactions Lily experienced during her school days. The work Lily created during these after-school sessions reflected her emotional state more than she realized. Her recent paintings had grown darker and more intense, featuring stormy landscapes, isolated figures, and compositions that suggested internal conflict. Mrs. Rodriguez had commented on the power of these pieces, noting that great art often emerged from periods of personal struggle, but she'd also expressed concern about what might be driving such intense emotions in someone so young. What worried Lily most about her situation at Riverside wasn't just the daily harassment, but the way it was affecting her academic performance and artistic development. The constant stress of avoiding Jessica's crew and anticipating their next move was exhausting, leaving her with little energy for the creative work that had always been her outlet. Her grades were suffering in subjects outside of art, and she'd begun to question whether she'd be able to build the kind of portfolio needed for serious art school applications. The financial pressures facing her family added another layer of complexity to her situation. Her mother's new position paid well, but the moving expenses and the cost of establishing themselves in a new place had strained their savings. Lily knew that any college plans would depend heavily on scholarships and financial aid. which meant maintaining strong grades and developing an exceptional portfolio. The idea of letting her family down after everything they'd sacrificed for. This move felt almost unbearable. Marcus had sensed her struggles during his recent visits, though Lily had tried to hide the extent of the problems she was facing. He'd noticed her withdrawn behavior and the way she seemed constantly on edge, but when he'd asked directly about school, she deflected his questions with vague reassurances. She'd learned from experience that Marcus's protective instincts could sometimes make situations worse, and she'd been hoping to handle the situation on her own. The truth was that Lily felt trapped between competing desires for independence and safety. Part of her wanted to prove that she could navigate this challenge without help, while another part of her longed for the security she'd felt when Marcus was more actively involved in her daily life. The self-defense training he provided felt like a secret weapon that she hoped never to use, but she was beginning to wonder whether passive endurance would be enough to get her through the remaining months of high school. As autumn progressed and the harassment from Jessica's group escalated, Lily found herself spending more and more time alone in the art room, working on increasingly complex pieces that helped her process emotions she couldn't express anywhere else. The solitude that had once felt peaceful was beginning to feel like isolation, but she couldn't see any other options that wouldn't make her situation worse. The evening light was fading outside the art room windows as Lily finished cleaning her brushes and prepared to pack up her supplies. In a few hours, she'd be back in her small apartment, helping her mother prepare dinner and pretending that everything at school was fine. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation through hostile territory, another opportunity for Jessica and Connor to find new ways to make her feel unwelcome. What Lily didn't realize was that her pattern of staying late in the art room had been noticed by exactly the wrong people, and that her refuge was about to become the setting for a confrontation that would change everything. Riverside High School operated on an unspoken caste system that had evolved over decades, with each generation of students reinforcing the same hierarchical structure that gave certain individuals nearly unlimited social power. At the apex sat the basketball players, whose success on the court translated directly into influence over every aspect of school life. Their dominance wasn't just athletic, it was cultural, shaping everything from which tables were available in the cafeteria to who could speak freely in group projects without being dismissed or ridiculed. Connor Hayes embodied this system perfectly. His locker was positioned in the main hallway where everyone had to pass between classes, creating a natural gathering spot for his followers and admirers. Teachers would pause their conversations when he walked by, offering encouraging words about upcoming games or asking about his college recruitment process. The principal, Mr. Davidson, had been known to personally escort college scouts through the school to meet Connor, treating him like visiting dignitary rather than a student who was supposed to be focusing on academics. The basketball team's influence extended far beyond the players themselves. Their girlfriends, siblings, and closest friends formed an inner circle that controlled social events, determined which students were accepted into various clubs and activities, and essentially decided who mattered at Riverside High. Jessica Walsh had leveraged her relationship with Connor into a position of supreme authority among the junior and senior classes, but her power was entirely dependent on maintaining that connection and demonstrating her value to the overall hierarchy. This dynamic created a constant pressure for Jessica to prove her worth through increasingly elaborate displays of dominance over students she perceived as threats or simply as convenient targets. Her father's position as a successful businessman and her mother's role on the school board provided additional protection, ensuring that her actions rarely faced serious consequences. Teachers had learned that challenging Jessica often meant dealing with angry phone calls from influential parents and awkward conversations with administrators who preferred to avoid conflict. The art program existed in a strange liminal space within this hierarchy. because it wasn't considered academically rigorous by the school's sports-focused culture. Art students were generally ignored rather than actively persecuted. However, this protection only extended as long as they remained invisible and didn't challenge the established order. Students who showed exceptional talent or received too much positive attention from teachers could quickly find themselves targeted by those who resented any recognition that didn't flow through approved channels.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mrs. Rodriguez understood this delicate balance better than most faculty members. She'd learned to celebrate her students' achievements quietly, offering private encouragement while avoiding the kind of public praise that might attract unwanted attention from the wrong people. Her classroom had become an unofficial sanctuary for students who didn't fit into the school's mainstream social groups, but she was careful not to make this too obvious to administrators who might view it as problematic. The guidance counseling system at Riverside High was overwhelmed and underfunded, with 3 counselors responsible for 800 students. They focused primarily on scheduling issues and college applications for high-achieving students, leaving little time for addressing social conflicts or emotional support. When bullying incidents were reported, they were typically handled through brief mediation sessions that accomplished little beyond creating additional targets for retaliation. Lily had witnessed this system's failures during her first month at the school. A sophomore named Tyler had complained to his counselor about being harassed by several basketball players who'd taken to shoving him into lockers and making jokes about his appearance. The counselor had arranged a meeting between Tyler and the team members where they'd offered perfunctory apologies and promised to leave him alone. Within a week, the harassment had escalated to include the players' friends from other grades, and Tyler had eventually stopped coming to school regularly rather than endure the daily torment. The cafeteria served as the most visible arena for the school's social dynamics. The basketball team claimed the large round table near the windows, with Connor and Jessica holding court at its center. Surrounding tables were occupied by their various supporters and wannabes, creating concentric circles of influence that radiated outward from this central power source. Students understood instinctively where they belonged in this arrangement, and violations of the unwritten seating rules could result in public humiliation or worse. Lily had learned to time her lunch period carefully, arriving early enough to claim a small table in the corner where she could eat quickly and leave before the main social drama began. She'd observed the daily rituals of power from this safe distance, watching as Jessica would scan the room for potential targets while Connor entertained his teammates with stories that usually involved putting someone else down. Their laughter was performed as much as it was genuine, designed to reinforce their status and remind everyone else of their place in the hierarchy. The hallways between classes presented the greatest danger for students like Lily. The crowds and chaos created opportunities for seemingly accidental collisions, dropped books, and whispered insults that were difficult for teachers to notice or address. Jessica had perfected the art of inflicting maximum humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability, timing her attacks for moments when adult supervision was minimal and witnesses were unlikely to intervene. The school's policy on bullying was well-intentioned but poorly enforced. Written guidelines called for immediate investigation of reported incidents and appropriate consequences for perpetrators, but the reality was far more complicated. When the accused students came from influential families or were valuable athletes, investigations tended to be cursory and punishments minimal. Students who filed complaints often found themselves facing increased harassment rather than resolution. Athletic events served as opportunities for the school's power structure to reinforce itself publicly. Basketball games drew the entire community, with local businesses sponsoring the team and parents treating the players like celebrities. Jessica and the other girlfriends occupied premium seating, their presence adding to the spectacle and demonstrating their importance to the overall social ecosystem. Students who didn't attend games were seen as disloyal or antisocial, creating additional pressure to participate in activities that celebrated the very system that marginalized them. The art room's location in the older wing of the school building made it particularly isolated during after-school hours. While the main corridors remained active with sports practices and club meetings, this section of the building was largely abandoned once regular classes ended. Mrs. Rodriguez had fought to keep the space available for students who wanted to work on projects outside of regular class time. But the lack of security cameras and minimal foot traffic made it potentially dangerous for students who might be targeted. School administrators were aware of this vulnerability, but had limited resources to address it. Budget constraints meant that security personnel focused on the main areas where large groups gathered, leaving peripheral spaces like the art wing with only occasional patrols. The assumption was that students working late in these areas were there voluntarily and could leave if they felt unsafe. But this ignored the reality that some students had nowhere else to go and limited alternatives for pursuing their academic interests. The social media ecosystem surrounding Riverside High amplified every aspect of the school's hierarchy and conflicts. Students documented their daily lives obsessively, creating permanent records of social interactions that could be used as weapons or trophies depending on the circumstances. Jessica maintained carefully curated profiles that showcased her relationship with Connor and her position at the center of the school's social universe. But she also used these platforms to subtly target students who had attracted her attention negatively. Group chats and private messaging allowed for coordination of harassment campaigns that were difficult for adults to detect or address. Students could plan coordinated actions, share embarrassing photos or information, and maintain constant pressure on their targets through digital channels that operated beyond school supervision. The result was a 24-hour environment of potential threat that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the campus. The upcoming autumn dance represented a major social event that would reinforce existing hierarchies while creating new opportunities for conflict. Jessica was deeply involved in the planning process, using her influence to ensure that the event would showcase her relationship with Connor and demonstrate her importance to the school community. Students who didn't conform to the expected social patterns often found themselves excluded from such events, either through direct rejection or by making the environment so hostile that participation became impossible. As October progressed and the harassment targeting Lily intensified, the art room became increasingly important as her only refuge within the school environment. However, her predictable presence there, after hours, was beginning to attract attention from exactly the people she was trying to avoid. The isolation that made the space feel safe also made it dangerous, setting up conditions for a confrontation that could escalate beyond anything she had experienced so far. The combination of institutional indifference, social media amplification, and a culture that celebrated dominance over empathy had created an environment where vulnerable students faced constant threat with minimal protection. Lily's artistic talents and quiet demeanor made her particularly visible to those who viewed difference as a challenge to their authority, while her outsider status meant she lacked the social connections that might have provided some measure of safety. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every assumption about power, vulnerability, and the consequences of underestimating someone who had learned to survive in hostile environments through careful preparation and hidden strength. The first real confrontation came on a Thursday morning during third period when Lily was walking to her advanced placement history class. She'd been carrying her portfolio case along with her regular backpack, having planned to show Mrs. Rodriguez a new piece she'd completed the night before. The hallways were crowded with students moving between classes, creating the usual chaos of bodies, voices, and locker doors slamming shut. Lily had learned to navigate these transitions by staying close to the walls and moving quickly, but her portfolio case made her more cumbersome than usual. She was focused on protecting her artwork from the jostling crowd when she felt someone deliberately step on the back of her shoe, causing her to stumble forward. The portfolio case slipped from her grip, and she watched in horror as it fell toward the floor, where dozens of feet could potentially trample her weeks of work. Jessica Walsh appeared beside her as if from nowhere, her perfectly manicured hand reaching down to grab the portfolio case before it hit the ground. For a moment, Lily felt a rush of gratitude and relief, thinking that perhaps she'd misjudged Jessica's intentions. The blonde girl straightened up with a sweet smile, holding the black case protectively against her chest. "Oh my goodness, you almost lost this," Jessica said loud enough for nearby students to hear. "That would have been such a tragedy." Her voice carried that particular tone of false concern that immediately put Lily on edge. The students around them began to slow their pace, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. "Thank you," Lily said quietly, reaching for her portfolio case. "I can take it now." Jessica pulled the case back slightly, just out of Lily's reach. "I'm just worried about you, sweetie. You seem so overwhelmed trying to carry all this stuff. Maybe you should consider simplifying your life a little bit." Her friends had materialized around them now, forming a loose circle that blocked Lily's path to her classroom. "I'm fine, really," Lily insisted, her voice barely audible above the hallway noise. "Could I please have my portfolio back?" Of course you can have it back," Jessica replied with exaggerated patience. "I'm just trying to help you understand that sometimes when we try to do too much, we end up making mistakes that hurt other people." She was looking directly into Lily's eyes now, and her meaning was crystal clear. This wasn't about the dropped portfolio case at all. Connor Hayes had appeared behind Jessica, his tall frame casting a shadow over the smaller girl. "What's going on here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew exactly what was happening. "Everything okay, babe?" "Oh, everything's perfect," Jessica replied without taking her eyes off Lily. "I was just helping our new friend here with her art supplies. She's obviously very dedicated to her craft." The way she emphasized the word craft made it sound like something childish and pathetic. Lily could feel the heat rising in her cheeks as more students gathered around them. The late bell for third period had rung, but nobody seemed in a hurry to get to class. These kinds of social confrontations were rare entertainment, and everyone wanted to see how it would play out. She was acutely aware that whatever happened next would be discussed throughout the school for days. "I really need to get to class," Lily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "May I please have my portfolio?" Jessica tilted her head to one side, as if considering this request very carefully. "You know what? I think we need to look at what's inside here first. I mean, if you're carrying around potentially dangerous or inappropriate material, it's really the school's responsibility to check, don't you think?" Her friends giggled appreciatively at this logic. "There's nothing inappropriate in there," Lily protested, but her voice cracked slightly. "It's just my artwork for class." "Oh, I'm sure it's all very innocent," Jessica said, beginning to unzip the portfolio case. "But you never know what people might be hiding behind those quiet, artistic exteriors. Sometimes the shy ones are the ones you really have to watch out for." The zipper sound seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet hallway. Lily felt panic rising in her chest as she realized that Jessica was actually going to go through her private work in front of this crowd. The pieces in that portfolio represented months of emotional processing, personal thoughts and feelings translated into visual form that she'd never intended to share with anyone except Mrs. Rodriguez. "Stop," Lily said, reaching for the case again. "Please don't do that." Connor stepped forward, positioning himself between Lily and Jessica. "Whoa there, art girl. Nobody's trying to hurt your precious drawings. We're just looking out for the school community. You understand, right?" His tone was patronizing, as if he were explaining something obvious to a small child. Jessica had the portfolio open now and was lifting out the top piece, a charcoal drawing of a solitary figure standing in a dark landscape. The composition was powerful and emotionally resonant, clearly the work of someone with genuine talent and deep feelings. But in Jessica's hands, held up for the gathered students to see, it looked melodramatic and pretentious. "Oh wow," Jessica said with mock admiration. "This is so dark and dramatic. Are you okay, Lily? This seems like maybe you're going through some really intense emotional stuff. Maybe you should talk to the guidance counselor about these feelings you're having." The students around them began to murmur and laugh, not because the artwork was actually bad, but because Jessica's tone had told them how they were supposed to react. Lily watched in horror as her personal expression was turned into a source of public ridicule, her private thoughts exposed and twisted for everyone's entertainment. "That's a really good drawing," said a quiet voice from the back of the crowd. Emma Chun, a freshman who occasionally ate lunch alone near Lily's table, had spoken up despite the obvious social risk. Several older students turned to look at her with surprise and annoyance. "Nobody asked you, freshman," Connor said dismissively. "Maybe worry about your own business." Jessica was pulling out another piece now, this one a painting of storm clouds gathering over a small house. Again, it was technically skilled and emotionally powerful, but she held it up as if it were evidence of some kind of mental instability. "This is concerning, don't you think? All these dark, lonely images. I'm starting to worry about what kind of thoughts you might be having, Lily." "Please stop," Lily whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Those are private." "Private?" Jessica's voice took on a tone of fake concern. "Honey, when you bring things to school, they're not private anymore. And honestly, I think someone should know about the kind of disturbing content you're creating. This could be a cry for help." The humiliation was overwhelming, but underneath it, Lily felt something else beginning to build. The weeks of harassment, the constant feeling of being hunted and vulnerable, and now this public violation of her most personal work was creating a pressure that felt dangerous. Her hands were shaking, but not entirely from fear anymore. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the crowd, having noticed that her advanced placement students were missing from class. "What's happening here?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of an adult who had dealt with teenage drama for many years. "Oh, Mrs. Rodriguez," Jessica said brightly, immediately shifting to her most innocent persona. "I was just helping Lily with her art supplies. She dropped her portfolio, and I was making sure nothing was damaged." She began carefully placing the artwork back in the case, handling it with exaggerated care. The art teacher looked from Jessica to Lily, taking in the tears in the younger girl's eyes and the crowd of entertained students. "I see. Well, why don't we get everyone to their classes now? The period is already 10 minutes old." "Absolutely," Connor agreed, putting his arm around Jessica's shoulders. "We were just being good citizens, making sure new students feel welcome and supported." His smile was perfectly calibrated to appear helpful to an adult while maintaining its predatory edge for Lily. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, students heading toward their delayed classes while continuing to discuss what they'd witnessed. Emma Chun lingered for a moment, catching Lily's eye with a look of sympathy before hurrying away to avoid further attention from Connor and his friends. Jessica handed the portfolio case back to Lily with a sweet smile. "There you go, sweetie. All safe and sound. I hope this little incident helps you understand how important it is to be more careful with your personal belongings. You never know when someone might get the wrong idea about what you're thinking or feeling." The threat was clear, even wrapped in concerned language. Jessica was letting Lily know that she could turn her artwork into evidence of instability or dangerous thinking anytime she chose. In a school environment where any suggestion of mental health issues could lead to counseling sessions, parental conferences, and social isolation, this was a powerful weapon. "Thank you," Lily managed, to say, clutching her portfolio against her chest. Her voice was barely audible, and she hated herself for thanking someone who had just humiliated her so completely. "Anytime," Jessica replied. "That's what friends are for." She turned and walked away with Connor, their conversation immediately shifting to weekend plans as if nothing significant had happened. Mrs. Rodriguez waited until the other students were gone before approaching Lily. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Lily nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady as she tried to speak. The kindness in the teacher's tone almost broke down the fragile control she was maintaining over her emotions. "If you ever need to talk about anything, my door is always open," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "And if someone is bothering you, there are people who can help." But Lily knew that wasn't really true. The school's power structure protected students like Jessica and Connor, while students like her were expected to endure whatever treatment they received without making trouble for the administration. Reporting this incident would only make her situation worse while accomplishing nothing meaningful. She made it through the rest of the day by avoiding eye contact with everyone and speaking only when directly questioned by teachers. The story of her public humiliation had spread through the school's social networks, but the details had already been distorted to make Jessica appear more sympathetic and Lily more unstable or antisocial. By the time she reached her after-school refuge in the art room, the anger that had been building throughout the day was stronger than the humiliation or fear. Jessica had crossed a line by going through her personal artwork, turning her private expression into public entertainment. The violation felt deeper than the previous harassment because it had targeted the one thing that truly mattered to her. As she set up her easel and began working on a new piece, Lily found herself thinking about the self-defense training Marcus had provided. She'd never imagined actually using those skills, but the day's events had shown her how vulnerable she really was in this environment. Physical strength might not solve her problems, but the confidence that came from knowing she could defend herself might change how she carried herself through these daily confrontations. The painting that emerged that afternoon was different from her recent work. Instead of dark landscapes and solitary figures, she found herself creating something that suggested hidden power and potential transformation. She didn't fully understand what was driving the new direction, but she could feel something shifting inside her that would make the next confrontation very different from the first. The weeks following the portfolio incident created a dangerous shift in the dynamic between Lily and Jessica's crew. What had started as casual bullying had evolved into something more systematic and personal. Jessica seemed to take Lily's quiet resilience as a direct challenge to her authority, and each day brought new attempts to break down whatever defenses the quiet girl had managed to maintain. The harassment intensified in ways that were difficult for teachers to detect but impossible for Lily to ignore. Her locker combination was somehow discovered and changed, leaving her unable to access her books between classes. Paint from the art room mysteriously appeared on her clothes after she'd hung them in her gym locker. Anonymous notes with cruel messages were slipped into her textbooks, timed to fall out during classes when she opened them to participate. Connor had become more directly involved as well, no longer content to simply support Jessica's campaigns from the sidelines. He began timing his movements through the hallways to intercept Lily at vulnerable moments, using his size and athletic reputation to intimidate her without laying a hand on her. He would stand too close during conversations, block her path to exits, and make comments about how fragile she looked that carried unmistakable threats. The stress was affecting every aspect of Lily's life. Her grades began slipping in subjects outside of art, as she found it increasingly difficult to concentrate during classes. Her appetite disappeared, and the dark circles under her eyes grew more pronounced each week. Her mother noticed the changes, but attributed them to the normal difficulties of adjusting to a new school, especially since Lily continued to deflect questions about her social life with vague reassurances. Marcus had attempted several unexpected visits during this period, his protective instincts apparently triggered by subtle changes in Lily's behavior during their phone conversations. Each time, she managed to present a convincing facade of normalcy. But she could see the concern growing in his eyes. The military had taught him to recognize signs of someone under sustained pressure, and his questions were becoming more specific and harder to avoid. The art room remained Lily's only sanctuary. But even that space was beginning to feel less secure. She'd noticed Jessica's friends walking past the windows during her after-school sessions, their presence feeling more like surveillance than coincidence. Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned that other students had been asking questions about Lily's schedule and whereabouts, inquiries that the teacher had deflected, but that clearly concerned her. The autumn weather had turned colder, with early November bringing the kind of raw chill that made the school building feel like a fortress against the outside world. The shorter days meant that Lily's after-school art sessions now took place in near darkness, with only the art room's fluorescent lights creating a warm island in the otherwise empty wing of the building. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now carried an undertone of vulnerability that she couldn't ignore. On the Friday that everything changed, Lily had stayed later than usual to complete a large canvas painting that was due for her portfolio review the following week. The piece was ambitious, incorporating techniques she'd been developing over the past month while working through her emotional responses to the ongoing harassment. The painting depicted a figure emerging from shadows into light, symbolic of transformation and hidden strength that she hoped to find within herself. Mrs. Rodriguez had left around 4:30, reminding Lily to make sure the door locked behind her when she finished. The art teacher had seemed reluctant to leave her student alone, but a parent conference required her attention, and Lily had assured her that she would only be working for another hour or so. The building was officially open until 6 for various after-school activities, so her presence wasn't unusual or against any rules. The custodial staff had completed their work in this wing earlier than normal, leaving the hallways eerily quiet except for the distant sounds of basketball practice echoing from the gymnasium. Lily had grown accustomed to these background noises, finding them almost comforting as evidence that she wasn't completely alone in the building. The rhythmic bouncing of balls and shouts of coaches provided a steady soundtrack to her creative work. She was applying the final details to her painting when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside the art room. At first, she assumed it was a teacher or administrator making evening rounds, but the voices that accompanied the footsteps made her blood run cold. Jessica's distinctive laugh carried clearly through the door, followed by Connor's deeper voice, and the chatter of several other students. Lily quickly moved away from her easel, her heart racing as she tried to assess her options. The art room had only one exit, and it led directly into the hallway where the voices were coming from. The windows were too high and narrow to provide an escape route, and there were no interior doors that led to other classrooms or corridors. She was essentially trapped unless the group moved on to another part of the building. "I'm telling you, she's in there," Jessica's voice was saying. "She stays late every Friday. This is perfect timing because nobody else is around." The cruel satisfaction in her tone made it clear that this wasn't a chance encounter, but a planned confrontation. "Are you sure about this?" Connor asked, though his voice carried excitement rather than concern. "We could get in serious trouble if someone finds out." "Nobody's going to find out," Jessica replied confidently. "Coach Williams has practice until 6. The custodians are done with this wing. And little Miss Artist Girl never tells anyone anything anyway. She's too scared to make trouble for us." Lily pressed herself against the wall beside the door, hoping desperately that they would change their minds and leave. Through the small window in the door, she could see shadows moving in the hallway. As the group positioned themselves outside the art room, her mouth went dry as she realized that running away was no longer an option. "Should we knock?" asked another voice that Lily recognized as belonging to Madison, one of Jessica's closest friends. "Pretend we're here for something innocent? Why bother?" Connor said with a laugh. She knows why we're here. Let's just get this over with. The door handle turned slowly, and Lily watched in horror as the group began filing into the art room. Jessica entered first, her eyes immediately finding Lily cowering beside the door. Behind her came Connor, Madison, and two other girls from their usual crew, along with Jake Morrison, another basketball player who Lily recognized but had never directly interacted with. The six of them effectively filled the small space, their presence transforming the familiar art room into something threatening and claustrophobic. There she is, Jessica announced cheerfully, as if they were old friends meeting for a pleasant social gathering. Hard at work as always. What are you creating today, Lily? Another one of your dark and disturbing masterpieces? Lily pressed herself further against the wall, her mind racing through possible responses. Every option seemed dangerous. Compliance might encourage them to escalate their behavior, but resistance could trigger immediate violence. The training Marcus had provided felt distant and theoretical in the face of this real-world threat. We brought something special for you today, Connor said, reaching into his backpack and pulling out 2 cans of bright red spray paint. We thought it was time to add some color to your life. You're always working with such gloomy themes. This will really brighten things up. The sight of the paint can sent a jolt of terror through Lily. She'd heard stories about this kind of attack, usually targeting students who were seen as different or vulnerable. The paint would be difficult to remove from skin and could cause serious damage if it got in her eyes. More importantly, the humiliation would be captured on phones and shared throughout the school and beyond. Please don't do this, Lily whispered, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. I haven't done anything to any of you. That's exactly the problem, Jessica replied, her voice taking on the cold edge that Lily had learned to fear. You think you can just exist here without acknowledging the social order. You walk around like you're too good to interact with the rest of us, hiding in this room like some kind of tortured artist. It's time for you to learn how the real world works. Madison had moved to block the door while Jake positioned himself near the windows, ensuring that Lily had no escape route. The coordination of their movements suggested that this wasn't an improvised attack, but something they'd planned carefully. The realization that her predictable schedule had made her an easy target filled Lily with a mixture of fear and anger that was becoming harder to control. Here's how this is going to work, Connor explained, shaking one of the paint cans so that the metal mixing ball rattled ominously inside. You're going to stand very still while we give you a new look. If you cooperate, it'll be over quickly. If you make trouble, well, we've got all evening to figure out creative ways to use this paint. The casual cruelty in his voice broke something inside Lily. All the weeks of harassment, the constant fear, the sleepless nights worrying about what they might do next, suddenly crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. She wasn't going to let them do this to her. Not here, not in the space that represented everything she cared about, not when she had the skills to stop them. I said no, Lily said, her voice stronger now as she stepped away from the wall. The change in her posture was subtle but unmistakable, her weight shifting to the balls of her feet in a way that Marcus would have recognized immediately. Jessica laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. Oh, now she's got an attitude. I think the little mouse is trying to roar. How adorable. She nodded to Connor, who approached Lily with the spray paint can raised and ready. Last chance, art girl, Connor said, his finger moving toward the nozzle. Stand still and take it, or this gets a lot worse for you. What happened next unfolded with a speed and precision that none of them had anticipated. As Connor moved within arm's reach, Lily's training took over, her body responding with muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. Her left hand shot out to grab Connor's wrist, controlling the paint can while her right palm struck his solar plexus with enough force to double him over. The can flew from his grip, clattering across the floor and rolling under a table. The room erupted in chaos as the other attackers realized that their victim was fighting back. Jake lunged forward to help Connor, but Lily was already moving, her elbow connecting with his ribs before he could grab her. The years of training with Marcus had taught her to target nerve clusters and pressure points that would disable opponents quickly without causing permanent damage. Jessica screamed something that might have been a command or just an expression of rage, but Lily was beyond hearing individual words. The adrenaline flooding her system had triggered a state of hyper-awareness where everything seemed to move in slow motion. She could see Madison reaching for her phone to record what was happening, the two other girls backing toward the door in confusion, and Connor struggling to breathe while trying to get back to his feet. Jake swung wildly at Lily's head, but she ducked under his arm and swept his legs, sending him crashing into an easel that collapsed under his weight. Paint tubes scattered across the floor, creating splashes of color that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Lily rolled away from his falling body and came up in a fighting stance that Marcus had drilled into her until it became second nature. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Jessica shrieked, but her voice carried notes of fear that hadn't been there before. The confident predator who had entered the room was discovering that her chosen victim was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Connor had recovered enough to make another attempt at grabbing Lily, but his movements were clumsy and telegraphed. She sidestepped his charge and used his momentum against him, guiding him into a wall where he hit hard enough to leave a dent in the drywall. The second paint can fell from his jacket pocket, rolling across the floor to join its companion under the art supplies. The fight was effectively over within 30 seconds, though it felt like hours to everyone involved. Connor and Jake were both on the ground, neither seriously injured but thoroughly defeated. Madison stood frozen with her phone in her hand, apparently having forgotten to actually start recording. The two other girls had pressed themselves against the door, too shocked to flee but afraid to get involved. Jessica stood alone in the center of the room, her carefully constructed authority completely shattered. For the first time since Lily had known her, the queen of Riverside High looked genuinely afraid. The girl she'd thought was weak and helpless was standing over two athletic boys, who were supposed to be among the strongest students in the school. "You're insane," Jessica whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "You can't just attack people like this." "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Lily replied, her breathing barely elevated despite the physical exertion. "Tell them how 6 of you cornered one girl with spray paint. Explain what you were planning to do. I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing that story." The room fell silent except for Connor's labored breathing and the distant sounds of basketball practice continue in the gymnasium. Everyone present understood that the social dynamics that had governed their interactions for months had been permanently altered. The quiet girl who had endured weeks of harassment without fighting back had just demonstrated that her restraint had been a choice, not a limitation. Madison finally remembered her phone and began trying to film, but Lily moved toward her with the same controlled precision she'd used against the boys. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said calmly. "Unless you want to explain to your parents why you were here helping with an assault." The phone disappeared back into Madison's pocket with remarkable speed. The realization that they were all complicit in what could be legally classified as assault was beginning to sink in for everyone involved. What had seemed like harmless bullying from their perspective would look very different to adults and authorities. Jake struggled to his feet, clutching his ribs and eyeing the door. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his words carried no real threat. Everyone in the room understood that any future confrontations would require a very different approach. "Yes, it is," Lily replied with quiet certainty. "It's completely over, all of it. You're going to leave me alone from now on, and you're going to tell everyone else to do the same. Because if you don't, the next time won't be as gentle as this was." The word gentle hung in the air like a challenge. Connor was still struggling to catch his breath, and Jake could barely stand upright, but Lily showed no signs of fatigue or injury. The implication that she had been holding back during the fight was both humbling and terrifying for her former tormentors. Jessica made one last attempt to salvage her authority. "You think this changes anything? You think people are going to respect you now? You're still a freak, just a violent one now." Lily studied her former tormentor with something approaching pity. "I don't need people to respect me, Jessica. I just need them to leave me alone. And after today, I think they will." The group began filing out of the art room, their movements careful and deliberate. Connor had to lean on Jake for support, while Madison kept glancing back as if she expected Lily to attack again. Jessica was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway for one final exchange. "This won't stay secret," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Everyone's going to know what happened here." "I'm counting on it," Lily replied. The truth usually works in favor of the person who is defending themselves. After they left, Lily stood alone in the art room, surveying the damage. Easels were overturned, paint tubes were scattered across the floor, and there were scuff marks on the walls where Connor had hit them. But her painting was undamaged, still sitting on its easel like a symbol of something that couldn't be destroyed by violence or intimidation. She began cleaning up methodically, her hands steady despite everything that had just happened. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a sense of calm that she hadn't felt in months. The constant weight of fear and anxiety that had pressed on her chest since starting at Riverside High was simply gone, lifted by the knowledge that she could protect herself when necessary. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived just as Lily was finishing the cleanup, having returned to collect some papers she'd forgotten. She took in the scene with experienced eyes, noting the overturned furniture and the tension that still lingered in the air. "Is everything all right?" the teacher asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Everything's fine now," Lily replied, and for the first time in months, she meant it completely. The following Monday brought exactly the kind of change Lily had predicted. Word of the art room confrontation had spread throughout the school, but the story that circulated bore little resemblance to Jessica's usual narrative control. Students had heard that the quiet girl had defeated 2 basketball players in a fight, and the details grew more impressive with each retelling. Jessica and her crew maintained a careful distance from Lily, their body language broadcasting defeat to anyone who knew how to read social dynamics. Connor walked with a slight limp for several days, claiming it was from basketball practice, but everyone understood the real cause. The hierarchy that had seemed unbreakable just days before was revealed to have been built on nothing more than the collective agreement to pretend it was real. Emma Chun approached Lily during lunch that day, her voice filled with admiration and curiosity. "Is it true what they're saying about Friday? That you know martial arts?" Lily considered how to answer, aware that her response would shape how this story continued to spread. "I know how to defend myself," she said simply. "My brother taught me." The revelation that Marcus was military added another layer to the growing legend, providing context that made Lily's skills seem both more legitimate and more formidable. By the end of the week, half the school believed she was some kind of secret weapon, while the other half simply knew better than to test the theory. Mrs. Rodriguez had quietly arranged for additional security cameras to be installed in the art wing, ensuring that future incidents would be documented. She never asked Lily directly about what had happened, but her increased attention and support made it clear that she understood the situation perfectly. The most significant change came in a phone call Lily received the following weekend. Mr. Chun, a representative from a prestigious martial arts academy in California, had somehow learned about the incident and was interested in discussing scholarship opportunities. The conversation led to an application process that would eventually take Lily far from Riverside High and toward a future she'd never imagined possible. When Lily finally told Marcus about everything that had happened, his reaction surprised her. Instead of anger or concern about the violence, he felt pride in how she'd handled an impossible situation. The skills he'd taught her had served their purpose exactly as intended, protecting her when no one else could or would. The spray paint cans remained under the art room table for several days before being discovered by a custodian, serving as physical evidence of what might have happened if Lily hadn't been prepared to defend herself. The incident report that was eventually filed painted a clear picture of attempted assault that had been thwarted by the intended victim's quick thinking and training. Jessica and Connor both faced suspensions once the full story emerged. Their parents called in for conferences that made it clear this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. The social media posts that might have documented Lily's humiliation instead became evidence of their own poor judgment, shared by witnesses who had been inspired by her courage to speak up. The transformation in Lily's daily experience at Riverside High was complete and immediate. Students who had previously ignored her now nodded respectfully in the hallways. Teachers who had barely known her name began taking notice of her academic potential. The art room returned to being a sanctuary, but now it was protected by reputation rather than just geography. By the time graduation approached, Lily had become something of a legend at Riverside High. Her story was told to incoming students as an example of how appearances could be deceiving and why treating others with respect was always the wisest choice. The quiet girl who had once hidden behind her easel had become a symbol of hidden strength and the power of standing up for oneself when it mattered most. The final chapter of her time at Riverside came when she accepted the scholarship to the California Martial Arts Academy, an opportunity that would combine her artistic talents with advanced training in multiple fighting disciplines. As she packed her belongings and prepared to leave North Carolina behind, Lily reflected on how a moment of violence had ultimately led to freedom and opportunity she never could have imagined. The art room where everything had changed was eventually renovated, but Mrs. Rodriguez made sure that one of Lily's paintings remained permanently displayed there. The piece she'd been working on that Friday evening, depicting a figure emerging from shadows into light, became a reminder to future students that transformation was always possible for those brave enough to claim their own power. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.